in my opinion, right? It's not appropriate, other people might differ with this point, but it's not appropriate to talk about sort of the psychological mechanisms in which the former perpetrator copes with their shame or their guilt or their bereavement for the actions that they did. Remember, again, what we want to talk about is not the direct act, right? We're not necessarily concerned with the direct action, though this is grounds for initiating conversation. Did you commit action X? Yes, I did. The why did you commit action X is superficial. What's more important are what are the conditions that led you to commit action X, right? And I'll write that down, right? So what we need to know is what are or were the conditions that led you to right? What are the conditions that led you to commit the action, right? This is what we generalize, right? This is, our findings are generalized from this point. Not the particular individual, right? Not even so much the particular action, even though this is more generalizable than the particular individual. What we're really interested in, what are the conditions that unfolded in order to get you to do this particular action, right? So, insofar as we're interested in this, again, as I said in the last section, this is sort of the root of Milligram's obedience to authority, sort of canonical landmark research, is what are the conditions that are necessary? I'm not interested in the individual participant, right, per se. Really what I'm interested in is creating a condition, a situation in which nearly any participant, I can anticipate the response. I can anticipate the action of any participant given this scenario, right? And he found in his findings that overwhelmingly people are obedient to authority, independent to any type of ethical understanding that they have, right? So one of the weaknesses then is this. I mean, and this is quite obvious, right? The researcher's connection to the life story of the participant. Where the participant is labeled a perpetrator, it's imperative. It's difficult, but it's imperative to make sure that we don't cast judgment on the action of the participant. You're the bad guy in the story, right? Because what will end up happening is you'll either offend, I mean, I can't really think of an account where it happened. I've seen it on TV a few times. You might offend the participant to the point where the participant leaves your research, and that's bad. If you're not trained as a psychologist, you should stay away from the emotion-based questioning. I make sure my students recognize that that's off limits, right? We have to make sure that we don't frame the narrative, because what we then do is take their story, since we're indirectly, hopefully this isn't getting too complicated, I hope not. I feel like I'm going a little fast. Remember, we're indirectly connected to the life story of the participant. The participant is directly connected, right? CT, indirect. Right? Participant is directly connected to the life story, his or her life story. We, the researcher, are indirectly connected to the life story of the participant. We're interested in the actions that the participant participated in. But more than the action itself, we're interested primarily in the modes that led, the conditions that led the participant to perform action X, or some series of actions. All of this, then, after the fact, is taken into account in order to prepare our findings. Now, you can imagine that if I have bias, if my indirect connection to the life story of the participant, right, and now we're a lot deeper, right? If my indirect connection to the life story of the participant is biased by the label perpetrator, right? If my indirect connection to the life story of the participant is biased by the label perpetrator, then my findings will be biased as well. Right? If bias contaminates my relationship with the participant's life story, because the participant tells me that he was an SS guard, or he was a child soldier, or he was a wife beater, or he murdered someone in a fit of rage, or brutalized some human, or what have you. He was a gangbanger, or whatever it might be, right? If in recording my findings psychologically, quietly to myself, my interpretation of the narrative of the life story of the participant is biased, then that bias is going to come out in my findings, right? The way that we work around this bias, as I said at the bottom of 2A in 1.3, is that we bracket our bias, right? So if we are biased and we just can't get around our bias, what we need to do is bracket our bias, right? We bracket it. Right? We bracket our bias. So you might say something, for example, like, I grew up in the inner city and I was deeply affected throughout my formative years by gang violence. I lost family members to gang violence, blah, blah, blah. The reason why I'm saying this, obviously, is because it might influence the way in which I interpret the findings of the participant, right? So I bracket that. Insofar as I bracket that, the reader of your research can immediately look for bias surfacing, right? If they find bias surfacing and your research is worthy of, critique, then, the community will have a discussion. Hey, Dr. Campbell, when you said X, there was a little bit of emotional attachment to your assessment. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that our assessment, as much as possible, and some researchers might disagree with this. Talk to your particular committee members. Don't take what I'm saying necessarily at this point as definitive fact. Me personally, I like to read very objective, impersonal accounts from the researcher, right? And not, I don't want really to know about your particular interpretations and assessments of goodness or badness on the narrative. Of course you're going to interpret it, but if you're going to add a moral factor to that narrative, it might be the case that you have to, but you need to bracket it, right? I believe when he said X that, he might have been holding more information back. That might be relative to the fact that I'm reading your research or not, but it needs to be bracketed, right? Okay, so the next one, 2B, researcher, over-reliance on formal, rule-based discourse. For example, right, in interacting the researcher with the participant, a model might be, the sense of justice might infect, if you will, I use that term loosely, it might infect the way in which you conduct your research. Here's an example. Well, imagine I'm interviewing Bob. Well, Bob, you said X, right? Then shouldn't you have done something else? Well, you said, I'm interviewing a child soldier, you said that they told you that they would kill your family unless you killed more people. Didn't you recognize that was the wrong thing to do? Maybe, wow, it's pretty offensive, right? You're in a sense appealing to a system and indirectly condemning the action of the participant. Didn't you see that was wrong? It's not that that's not a good question to ask. It's not a qualitative research question to ask. That might be a great interrogation question to ask. And what people need to recognize is there's a very fine line. There's a very fine line. And I would really like to see, it would be an amazing publication. I'm not going to write it. But it would be an amazing publication to look at qualitative research and just the varied nuances in which a question can be changed just slightly, and the response and the mode of questioning can go from qualitative methods research immediately to interrogation. There's a very, very thin line dividing interrogation questions and qualitative methods research, right? Me asking the participant about the consistency of the narrative becomes a sense, it walks a slippery slope into interrogation, and you cannot do that, right? You are not qualified to do that. Well, Bob, you said that, if I remember right, you were here and she was there, but if she was there and you were there, wouldn't that have meant something else? So I don't understand, not necessarily a good question or bad question. You need to consult your particular IRB reps and your particular committee advisors, but I'm very, very aware, I'm very, very conscious of my students' research questions, their interview questions, specifically because I am not going to allow my students to interrogate their participants. And they don't do it intentionally, right? It's sort of a newbie error. But we have to make sure that insofar as we are assessing and trying to access the life story of the participant, that we don't do